Chapter 4 of Stories in Grey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories in Grey by Barry Payne. Chapter 4 Burden's Tomb, Part 1. 1. The Earthquake. Mrs. Langley and her companion, Mrs. Gilderay, both thought rather well of Mr. Agravine. It was their first visit to Egypt, and Mr. Agravine's greater experience had been of use to them. He was quiet and without presumption, an elderly man with tired and rather magnetic eyes. "He has a story, of course," said Miss Gilderay. "We all have," said Mrs. Langley, "and we never tell them." Miss Gilderay blushed. She was plain, kindly, sincere, and 35. Mrs. Langley was 5 years older, and looked 5 years younger. She was not beautiful, but everybody said she had nice eyes and a pretty figure. "I am glad he is coming on the Rameses," said Mrs. Langley. "He is useful. He has done it all before, and he knows more than the dragomans. Of course Mr. Castle is useful too. A frightful nuisance, though." "Oh, frightful!" Miss Gilderay assented. "Still, one feels sorry for him." In the lounge of the hotel after dinner that night, Mr. Agravine spoke to them about Sir Felix Burdon's tomb. The tomb was thus spoken of by careless people in Cairo and Luxor, but Sir Felix had merely been its excavator, and the work of excavation was not yet quite complete. It was the tomb of a high priest who had died in Thebes 1200 years before Christ was born. It was of considerable size and importance, and its mural paintings were interesting and well preserved. Mr. Agravine wished particularly to see this tomb, and said he should try if anything could be arranged through the dragoman on the boat. He was describing some interesting points about this tomb when young Mr. Castle came up and joined the group. He was always doing that, and sometimes he was a nuisance. He was a young man of 28, travelling by himself, and paying a good deal for excess luggage. He was possessed of many and elaborate clothes. Chance propinquity at the hotel dinner had introduced Mr. Agravine, and Mr. Agravine had in turn presented Mr. Castle. This had been at Mr. Castle's request, for he had very nearly decided to fall in love with Mrs. Langley. She was just enough interested in him to flirt with him, and only just. To-night she sent him away at once. "Go and find out the name of that very beautiful girl with the red hair." The girl with the red hair was travelling with two elderly ladies, who were set in a totally different key from her. The old ladies were Victorian. The girl looked as if she had walked straight out of a German fairy tale. Mr. Castle did not know his way about it all. At the end of the evening he had not got the required information. He came back to Mrs. Langley, and, though she laughed, she sent him away again. She was definitely not going to speak to him any more until he could tell her what she wanted to know. Chance gave it to him the next morning. He happened to see the girl come out of her room, and he noted the number. He had only to look now at the numbers in the hall and see what name was attached. He went to Mrs. Langley in triumph. "I've got it," he said. "She is Mrs. Averill." "Who is?" "The red-headed girl that you wanted to know about. She is travelling with two sisters, Miss Bryans. They are probably her aunts." "I don't think I care," said Mrs. Langley. "It was really her first name that I wanted to know." The subject turned up again on the first day of their departure from Cairo on the Rameses. Miss Averill and her two aunts happened also to be going on to Assouan on the Rameses, and Mrs. Langley, in a comparatively short space of time, had taught Miss Bryan an entirely new patience. As she walked the deck that evening after dinner with Mr. Castle by her side, she said, "What an idiot you are, if you do not mind my saying so. You never found out that girl's name at all. I give 2 minutes to it, and find out everything myself." "And what is her first name?" asked Mr. Castle, patiently. "Well, you ought to know. You ought to be able to deduce it from looking at her." "Yseult?" suggested the young man. "Oh, goodness, no! Her name is Zoey. Don't you think that's right?" "No," said Mr. Castle. "Zoey is a maid of Athens, very nearly as black as the ace of spades." "Rubbish! Anyway, Zoey Averill is not a maid of Athens. She is a maid of Oxford, and what Oxford has done to deserve it I don't know. Her aunts are highly cultivated and belong to a Browning Society. Now, why don't you go find out interesting things and tell them to me? You never seem to know anything." She sent him to fetch French coffee for her, and when he brought it decided she would take Turkish coffee that night. Really, she did not treat him very well. Her manner with Mr Agravine was quite different. On the day that they arrived at Luxor, Mr Agravine told them that there was quite a chance that they would be able to see Burdon's tomb. The dragoman of the boat had been Sir Felix Burdon's dragoman during his first season in Egypt. He had assisted him since in some trouble that Sir Felix had had with his labourers. It was quite possible that he would be able to arrange it. The dragoman did arrange it. Chance favoured him. Sir Felix was waiting for some heavy timbers, and meanwhile the work of excavation had ceased. He cursed the dragoman sincerely. He said most insulting and improbable things about the dragoman's ancestry. He told him that if he ever suggested such a thing again he would break his head with a stick, but none the less he permitted him to bring up his gang from the Rameses on the following day. They were not, of course, to enter the 2 chambers of the tomb which Sir Felix used as his living room and stores. The party from the Rameses, about 30 in number, crossed the river from Luxor and rode 5 miles. They halted and dismounted at the top of the long slope which led down to the tomb. Led by the dragoman, the procession of tourists passed down the sandy slope into the darkness, under a crest piled with great rocks. Then came the burning of magnesium wire and the dragoman's lecture, a little sketchy, because he did not know the tomb, on the paintings and inscriptions. He was most impressive. "This tomb has never been shown before, ladies and gentlemen. Special permit. No other dragomans can show it." He scooped up 2 inquiring Germans, who would have made a dash for that part of the tomb which they had been particularly requested not to enter, and shepherded his party out into the open again, all but 5 of them. Just as these 5 were leaving, they found themselves confronted by a man in grey flannel trousers and an old Norfolk jacket of brown canvas. He reminded Mrs Langley at once of Don Quixote. He began to speak to them about what they had seen, and he spoke with evident knowledge and authority. Miss Gilderay whispered a word to Mrs Langley, and Mrs Langley said, "I suppose so," and turned to the stranger. "You are Sir Felix Burdon, are you not?" "Yes, that's my name." "I asked you because we wanted so much to thank you for letting us come in here. It's too interesting for words. I hope we haven't been interrupting your work." "Not at all," said Sir Felix. "We don't start digging again till tomorrow. I was just waiting for some stuff to come up from Luxor. I shall be living here for the next 2 months, you know." "Living here?" said Mrs Gilderay. "Actually in this tomb?" "Why not? In here, or in a tent just outside. I make myself very comfortable, and it saves the bother of going backwards and forwards." "It seems wonderful. I supposed that you lived on the Lotus. We saw it just above Luxor." "Last year I used the dahabeah a good deal, and I am meaning to dine and sleep there to-night, but the Lotus leaves to-morrow for Assouan, taking some friends of mine who are to go on to the Second Cataract." As he spoke he glanced over the party. Mr Castle carried Mrs Langley's camera and fly whisk. Mrs Langley looked charming and Miss Gilderay earnest, and a pretty girl with red hair was talking to Mr Agravine on one side. "I tell you what," said Sir Felix cheerfully, "there's a very interesting bit of painting in that second chamber on the left there, and I think your dragoman missed it. I should really like to show you that. I will get candles." "It's very, very kind of you," said Mrs Langley, "but won't they be waiting for us?" "Oh, I hope so. Your dragoman knows that you are speaking with me, and therefore he must wait. We shan't keep them 5 minutes." He dived away into the darkness as he spoke, and returned with a box of candles. As they were lighting their candles it chanced that he heard Mr Agravine's name mentioned. "I wonder," said Sir Felix, "are you Mr Agravine, the collector, the great authority on Corot?" "A great authority on nothing, I'm afraid. But I've been a collector of pictures all my life, to my sorrow." "But why to your sorrow?" "A long story, and I should be ashamed to tell it." "When we get back to the boat," said Miss Gilderay, as she lighted her candle, "the rest will be very jealous of us." "What on earth for?" asked Sir Felix, laughing. "Because we have special privileges. The others have only had a dragoman. We get the real explorer." "Can't understand jealousy," said Sir Felix, "even if it's anything of importance." "Why not?" Mrs Langley asked. Sir Felix shrugged his shoulders. "To the ancient Egyptian," he said, "death was the only important thing that happened to him in his life. Once one gets that point of view one ceases to be jealous." "But it's rather amazing that you should have that point of view," said Mrs Gilderay. "Oh, well, explanations are long and tiresome things. Now, then, here is the thing I wanted to show you. Hold your candles up very high, please. That's right. It's really an astonishingly modern idea, considering the date at which it was painted. You see that figure—" He never finished that sentence. The floor of the chamber seemed to sway upwards. They staggered against one another. Mrs. Gilderay caught at a sliding surface of a wall, and fell to the ground grotesquely. There was a sharp hissing sound, followed by a roar like a cannonade, that drowned their exclamations. Then came a heavy thud. Thud, as of some titanic hammer beating down soft earth. And then all was still. Sir Felix alone still held his lighted candle in his hand. The other candles had fallen and gone out. Sir Felix helped Mrs. Gilderay to her feet again, and assured himself that nobody was hurt. They found and relit their candles. "But what on earth was it? What terrible thing has happened?" cried Miss Gilderay. "It seemed to me," said Mr Agravine, "like a shock of earthquake. It was as if a mountain had come down on us." "That is probably what has happened. If you don't mind waiting a moment, I'll go and see what I can find out. I'll be back as soon as I can." It seemed a long time before he returned. They spoke together in awed tones, speculating on the chances. When Sir Felix came back to them, he saw white, grave faces, but no sign of panic. He hesitated. He had practically to announce a death sentence on these 5 people and on himself. And then Mrs Langley spoke. "You have bad news, I see," said Mrs Langley. "But we have expected it. The entrance to the tomb is blocked?" "That is so," said Sir Felix. "It is bad for me, because I brought you back here. The rest of your party are safe outside. However, we must see if we can work a way out. I have a pick and a couple of shovels here." "Can't we do anything too?" asked Miss Gilderay. "Nothing at the moment, I think. Make yourselves as comfortable as you can there." He pointed to the chamber which had been furnished as his own living room. The men returned to the entrance hall, stripped to the waist, and began their labour. It was absolutely ineffective, and Sir Felix had known from the first that it would be ineffective. But everything had to be tried. The sand and rubble fell in on them, and they could make no way. At last they gave up. "Will you call the ladies who were with you?" said Sir Felix. "They had better know." 2. The confession of Sir Felix Burdon and of Mr Castle. Deck chairs had been found for the 3 women. Agravine and Castle sat on the ground, their backs to the wall. Sir Felix remained standing. There were plenty of candles, and the hall was brightly lit. "Tell us now," said Mrs Langley, "what the chances are." "We will look at the best side first," said Sir Felix. "We are 5 miles from Luxor, and Luxor is on the rail. The tools and the men needed for an attempt at rescue ought to be available and to be here within a very few hours. You're with Thomas Cook and Son, and they won't lose anybody if they can help it, and they are pretty potent people in Egypt. The natives will probably be scared, and may be reluctant to come to work here, but baksheesh and the hide whip are good arguments. I think we will take it for granted that everything that can be done to save us will most certainly be done." "I see," said Zoe Averill, "that you think it will be of no use." "I do, but I may be wrong. I am guided by the sounds we heard and by my knowledge of the conformation of the ground round here. I believe that we're buried too deep for them to reach us in less than a week's work. You must remember that they will probably find it difficult at first even to determine the point at which they shall dig. I have been talking it over with Mr Agravine, and we don't think that the air here will last more than 3 or 4 days. So now you see what I've done." "You must not say that again," said Mrs Langley. "Nobody here would be mad enough to hold you in any way responsible. Besides, we've talked it over, Miss Gilderay, Zoe Averill, and myself, and we also had come to the conclusion that there was very little hope. As it happens, we 3, more, perhaps, than most women, can take this quietly, and wait for death without making any fuss." "Yes," said Zoe, "I see you're looking at me, and I know I've been crying, but that was because of my people, and not for myself at all. So far as I myself am concerned, I'll tell you a secret, I'm glad." "How horrible!" said Agravine. And then they began to discuss together the best arrangements that could be made for the 3 days left to them. On one point they were unanimous. Those days were to be made as easy as possible. The candles that lit them, and the flame of the spirit stove, would burn up air. But the tomb was to remain lit, and they would eat and drink, though tomorrow they would die. And when there were signs that the last moments were approaching, they would not prolong the period of headache and malaise and nausea. Sir Felix had a charcoal stove, which he used for cooking on in the open. If this were lit, all would soon be over. There was not the slightest fear of any suffering from hunger or thirst. The chamber which Sir Felix used for his storeroom had already been filled for the season, and even a modified luxury would be possible. The women claimed for themselves the slight household work that there would be to do. Sir Felix used paper plates and dishes that would not need to be washed, and when used could be thrown, with all other refuse, down the deep shaft at the further end of the tomb. At night the men would camp in the entrance hall, on deck chairs. The women would fare a little more easily, dividing such bedding as there was among them in the room at the other end of the tomb. The big tank had been filled, and there was bottled water for drinking besides. The only thing that seemed likely to distress them was the actual waiting for 3 days before death came. At present they did not feel this at all. The earthquake shock had thrown them into something approaching stupor. Now came the reaction. They were excited, and talked eagerly. There was much to be done. The floor of the big hall had to be sprinkled with water, that the dust might not bother them. A table and seats had to be improvised, and a meal prepared. Young Castle, under direction, opened tins. Miss Gilderay busied herself at the spirit stove. Mr Agravine and Sir Felix were occupied with a little rough carpentry. There was much activity and good temper. There was even laughter at minor mishaps. It was an astounding and fantastic picnic in the very face of death. Presently Mrs Langley came up to Sir Felix. "Zoe, Miss Averill, and I have found among your stores a big package of native costumes. Women's costumes. May we use them?" "Of course you may. But please ask permission for nothing again. All that is here is common property. It belongs to all of us. I was commissioned by a lady in England to get those dresses for her, and the commission bored me terribly. Now I feel grateful to that lady." An hour later they all met at dinner. The materials of the repast had mostly come out of tins, but Miss Gilderay had been very clever. The champagne was excellent, though 2 of the men were compelled to drink from teacups. Mr Castle's voice began to be heard rather frequently. There was a faintly triumphant note in it, and it was not entirely due to champagne. The propinquity of Mrs Langley affected him. At the end of the repast, Mr Castle opened a gold cigarette case and presented it to Mrs Langley. She did not appear to see it, taking no notice of it. Selecting a cigarette himself, he took from his pocket a gold matchbox. All his waistcoat pocket furniture was of pure gold, and silver was nothing accounted. "Wait a moment, Mr Castle," said Sir Felix. "What do you think about it, Agravine? It's not as if we could open the windows and make the whole thing fresh again tomorrow." "By Jove, I hadn't thought of that," said Castle, and returned the cigarette to his case. "Well," said Agravine, "our principle was that we were to make it as easy for ourselves as possible. This hall is fairly lofty as compared with the smaller chambers. Suppose we permit each person 1 cigarette after dinner to night, and then see what it is like to morrow morning. I imagine we shan't notice it, but, if we do, we can set one of the smaller chambers of the tomb apart as a smoking room, hanging something over the entrance." "Good," said Sir Felix. "I think you are right." He produced his own cigarette case, and Mrs Langley and Miss Gilderay both took cigarettes from it. Zoe Averill did not smoke. There was a little buzz of conversation, and then a sudden silence. And into the silence broke the clear silvery voice of Zoe Averill. "I want to ask you something, Sir Felix. You look rather anxious, and I don't understand anxiety when the end is so certain. What is it you are afraid of for us?" "I'll tell you frankly. I'm afraid of reaction. I have got no words to say how splendid I think you 3 women have been. You all seem without fear. But we have many hours before us yet. There will be little or nothing to do. Here we shall be in prison together, glaring at one another. If our cheerfulness broke down, if we ceased to be good-tempered, if we got to long for the end, well, it's possible." "Tell us your story, Sir Felix," said Mrs Langley. "My story? What do you mean?" "The story of yourself." "I've never yet told it. I'd never meant to tell it at all. Yet, now that I come to think about it, I don't know that it wouldn't ease my mind to make a confession before I died. You will none of you think very well of me when you've heard it, and so I must make one condition. There is not to be one word of comment." To this all agreed. I am at present 38 years of age. When I was a boy of 14, early one summer morning I wrecked the whole of my life. It is in consequence of what I did, or failed to do, then that I succeeded to the baronetcy, if that is worth anything, and became a rich man, and have never since had one moment of complete happiness. What I've got to tell you is that I was a coward. Even now, in similar circumstances, I think I might be a coward again. There are people who have no fear. There are people who are brave enough for the ordinary things of life, but have one special fear which overmasters them. I believe there are many such, and I was one of them. With some men the overmastering horror is connected with fire. They live in dread of it. They never go to a hotel or a house for the first time without looking from their windows to find what they would do in case of fire. The thing haunts them. My case was different. I was supposed to be a particularly courageous and high-spirited boy, but I also was haunted by the fear of drowning. I was afraid of the water. As a child, when I first saw the sea, I screamed in terror. As I got older and went to school, I had to get over this to some extent. I managed, with the greatest agony to myself and with the strictest concealment of my real feelings, to learn to swim. In the summer holidays I bathed every morning with my elder brother in the river before breakfast. I used to pretend that I loved it. And yet every day it was all I could do to get myself to go in. There. Can't you guess the rest of it? No. Don't speak." He took a sip of champagne and continued his story. On the morning in question, Adrian, his elder brother, who was an expert swimmer, had remained long in the water after Felix had left it. Suddenly Adrian was attacked by cramp and cried for help. "I was unable to move," said Sir Felix. "I stood there on the bank, half dressed, looking at him, and I was actually unable to move. I could not make myself do it. I pictured him dragging me down into the green water. I also began to cry loudly for help. I told myself that when he was insensible, and it would be safe for me to tackle him, I would go in and rescue. But it was not till I heard steps and became afraid of being found on the bank that I managed to fall into the water. I never reached my brother. Fear had taken all the power from my muscles. I could not swim at all. I went down at once. When we were taken out by the men who came in answer to my call, he was dead and I was insensible. I recovered, told a lying story, and let people praise my heroism. Can you wonder that the recollection of that morning has haunted me all my life? I, who hate cowardice and lies and selfish brutality, have to look upon myself as a coward, a liar, and a murderer. Since then I have done everything I could, short of actual suicide, to end it. In South Africa the Boer bullets and the enteric took better men and left me free. Here in Egypt I found a fascination. Here also lived people who all their lives through had looked forward to their death. Excavation, too, has its risks, or can be made to have them. I have shirked none of them. I have even invented them, and all the time I have had to put a good face on things before the world. I dared not let people know what I really was. I joined in sports, I laughed at jokes, I pretended to be interested in all manner of things. It is a relief unspeakable to me that from this moment, for the few hours that will elapse before I die, I need pretend no longer. I have shown myself as I am." There was complete silence when he finished speaking. It had been agreed that there was to be no word of comment. Then openly, across the table, Mrs Langley stretched out her hand to him, and he held it for a moment. Miss Gilderay, rising, with Zoey Averill close to her, began to clear away things. Mr Agravine, helping them, sought and found an occasion to say something absolutely commonplace. Suddenly Mr Castle brought his hand down on the table. "Wait a moment," he said. "If you don't mind, I mean. If I don't do it now, I never shall." "What is this, Mr Castle?" asked Mr Agravine. "My name's not Castle, but that's no matter. It's the only name you'll ever know me by. I've got a story to tell, a true story. The night's young, and in any case we shall be getting a long sleep soon." "Don't get excited about it, Mr Castle," said Mrs Langley quietly. "We are quite willing to hear you." Those who had risen from their places sat down again, and the young man began. "I suppose I ought to blame myself alone for what I am going to tell you, but I don't. I blame my father more than myself. He's a solicitor in Lincoln's Inn Fields. I daresay you'd know the name if I gave it. I have been on bad terms with him all my life. All my life he has kept me short of liberty and short of money. He forced me to take, or to pretend to take, his views on religion and politics and everything. It was only by hypocrisy that I could make life with him tolerable. He insisted upon it that I should follow his profession, though he knew that I hated it. I don't care now whether I'm laughed at or not, and I'll tell you what I wanted to be. I wanted to be an actor. He would not hear of that, of course. He had given me a good education, public school in Oxford, and I was to go into his office. I hated it, but I did what I was told. I went through my articles, I passed all necessary examinations. I became admitted as a solicitor, and then, for years, I did the work of managing clerk for him for about half a managing clerk's salary. At 27 I had very little more freedom than I had at 17. I was not allowed a latchkey. I had to give an account of everything that I did and almost everything that I thought. It would have been just if I had been taken into partnership, but my father would not hear of that. I was to inherit the business when he died, and until then I might wait. So it went on. Month after month of formal and uninteresting routine. Month after month of snubs and checks. If ever a man hated his father, I hated mine. Well, he'd screwed down the safety valve, and after that it was his own lookout. What happened was inevitable." He paused a moment, irresolute. "Go on," said Miss Langley. "Oh, I'm not going to shirk it. One day last July my father handed me the firm's cheque for £900. I was to cash it and go on to the office of another solicitor to complete a purchase on behalf of a client. It was the kind of thing I had often done before. As you know, of course, payment is generally made in Bank of England notes. Until that moment, when I had that cheque in my hands, I had formed no plan at all. I had had a specially exasperating week with my old father, and was determined that something would have to be done. As I slipped that cheque into my pocket, I decided what it should be. I got cash for the cheque, taking the greater part of it in small notes and £20 in gold. I was very well known at the bank. If I had asked for the whole of it in gold, I doubt it would have aroused any suspicion. Then I got into a cab and drove round to one or two shops and bought a dressing case and some other things. The change had begun already. My father did not permit me to take cabs when a bus would serve, or a bus when it was an easy walk, though he never went anywhere except in a cab himself. I knew that the last place in which they would look for me would be in the neighbourhood of Lincoln's Inn Fields, and so I went to a small hotel in Holborn. For 2 or 3 days I lay low, and watched the papers carefully, morning and evening, expecting to find some account of my disappearance. There was never a word about it, and then I knew that I was quite safe. My father had not taken the view that I had been abducted by thieves, but that I myself was a thief. To save his name and the name of his firm, he would be quite willing to pay that 900 out of his own pocket. I laughed at the thought of it. It occurred to me, however, that he would probably have put private detectives on to me, and for some weeks I was careful, going out only at night in closed cabs. It was dull, because I knew nobody. I still watched the papers, and still found no allusion to myself. I had expected a veiled notice in the agony column of the Times, but there was nothing. The old man had evidently determined to cut me off altogether. At last, one night, more because I was sick of the solitude than because I thought it was safe, I crossed over to Calais by the night boat. I remained in Paris for a few weeks, and then started off on a kind of walking tour. I made a good many acquaintances, and I thoroughly enjoyed myself. I never had the slightest qualm of conscience, and I am not sure that I have any now. I said to myself that I had not stolen the £900, I had merely drawn my back pay. I got plenty of amusement, and incidentally I improved my French. On my return to Paris I happened to be in Cook's office one day and heard a man inquiring about Egypt. It was now November. My walking tour had cost me very little, and I still had plenty of money left. That is how I came here. There is my story, and you can think what you like." "Thank you for telling us," said Mrs Langley. "It is better to make no other comment." "I notice," said Mr Castle, bitterly, "that you do not give me your hand." "I do not," said Mrs Langley. "You can treat me as a leper, if you like." "Nor do I do that." Miss Gilderay broke in hastily. "But what did you mean to do when the money was all gone?" "I was willing to do anything except to arise and go to my father. If I had found an opportunity I should have taken it. If I had found none, I should probably have committed suicide. Burdon's tomb has spared me my pains." And from that time onward Mr Castle began to give trouble. End of Chapter 4. Recording by Todd. Chapter 5 of Stories in Grey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Stories in Grey by Barry Payne. Chapter 5 Burdon's Tomb, Part 2. 3. The Confession of Miss Gilderay and of Mrs Langley. The night seemed interminable. Sir Felix Burdon, an old campaigner, slept well enough in his deck chair, but all the others were restless. In the passage one candle burned. Its flame, absolutely motionless in the still and yellow air, was like a piece of burnished metal. At the farther end of the tomb, in the chambers where the women slept, low voices could be heard at intervals all through the first hours of night. At 5 in the morning all was still. Mr Agravine, who had tried 1,000 positions, had found one in which he was able to sleep. Castle, who had stretched himself at full length on the sandy floor, lay with his face on one arm, breathing heavily. Suddenly Castle sprang to his feet. "I want to get out of this!" he shouted wildly. "I'm not going to die like a rat in a trap. Let me out! I've got money to spend, I tell you. I must get out!" Sir Felix Burdon, awakened by the noise, sprang to his feet. He was rather angry. "Hold your row," he said. "Do you want to wake everybody? If you start that screaming again, I'll gag you." Castle collapsed. He sat on the floor with his head in his hands, rocking to and fro. "Give me a drink, and I'll keep quiet," he said. "If I can't get out, give me a drink." "Oh, go and get what you want," said Sir Felix, contemptuously. Agravine, who had lighted his candle, watched the scene with grave and dispassionate eyes. Castle went off to the stores. They could hear him moving about there. Presently he returned with a cup and a bottle of whisky. His exceedingly elaborate knife contained a corkscrew among other implements, and he drew the cork. "Why don't you all join me?" he asked. "Best thing you can do." The other men refused, as briefly as possible. Castle poured the whisky into the cup and began sipping it. "This is doing me good," he said. "I was suffering from chill, that is what it was. Might happen to anybody. This is the finest thing on earth, taken medicinally." Nobody paid any attention to him. For half an hour he went on sipping steadily. Then he drove the cork into the bottle with one blow of his fist, and flung himself at full length on the sand again. A moment later he was snoring. Sir Felix and Mr Agravine were both awake now. They glanced at him, and their eyes met. "Yes," said Agravine, "I'm afraid he's a skunk. He was all right in the hotel, and all right on the boat. But this experience has tried him a little too high. What ought we to do?" Sir Felix shrugged his shoulders. "I don't see that we can do anything. It's only a short time now, anyhow. I don't know if it's my fancy, but the air here seems to me to be worse and closer already. If he wants to die like a hog, he must. Of course, if he gets noisy, we shall have to take some measures, but as long as the stuff makes him sleep, well, he's best asleep." And then for a while they dozed fitfully. At 7 o'clock they could hear sounds of movement at the further end of the tomb, and then Zoe Averill appeared at the entrance of the hall. She wore a long native robe of dark blue. "We're making some tea," she said. "Shall I bring you some?" "That would be very kind of you," said Sir Felix. "I hope you've slept." "I slept very well indeed. I had a little room all by myself. But I think the other two did not sleep so well. Miss Gilderay looks very tired and worn out." Miss Gilderay and Mrs Langley brought in the tea, but waited only for a moment and then went back to their own quarters. Hot tea, a wash in cold water, and a change of clothing refreshed the two men. They sat up and talked in low voices, while Castle still lay and snored. "An experience like this," said Agravine, "makes one realize what an absolute fantastic and foolish thing property is. One begins to wonder why one ever attached any importance to it. As you know, I simply gave up my life to the acquisition of one form of property beautiful things, pictures. How absolutely absurd! Nothing of it is any good to me now, and I cannot take it along with me. Here in this small, imprisoned society for a few hours we lose the sense of property altogether. I am wearing one of your shirts, Sir Felix. It doesn't seem to me to matter in the least whose shirt it is. I really heartily thank you. Community of goods becomes quite easy when one knows that one will soon be dead. And," he added sardonically, "becomes still easier when one man in the society finds all the goods, and the rest simply do the communing." Sir Felix laughed. He pointed with his foot to the prostrate Castle. "Shall we wake up the beggar?" he said, "and let him clean himself up a bit?" "No," said Agravine. "The longer he sleeps, the better his nerves will be when he wakes." An hour later Castle awoke of his own accord. He certainly did seem very much better. He was ashamed of himself, and apologetic. "Afraid I kicked up rather a row last night. Sorry. I suppose my nerves gave way. I shall be all right now that I've had a sleep." "Oh, yes," said Sir Felix kindly. "You'll be all right. You've missed some very good tea by your slumbers. I dare say they'll make some more for you." "Thanks," said Castle. "I don't want to trouble them. I'll wait till they join us." Meanwhile he proceeded with his toilet, and accomplished the rather difficult task of cutting himself with a safety razor. Of his own accord he washed the cups which had been used, and took them and the whisky bottle back to the store room. There he found Zoe Averill and Miss Gilderay, and remained talking with them for a little time. Presently the whole party gathered together again round the trestle table in the entrance hall of the tomb. The table was laid just as neatly and carefully as if it had really mattered. The women had seen to that. Zoe Averill still wore the native robe, the other two were in their ordinary clothes. Castle was quite good humoured at lunch and very talkative. It was fairly obvious that he was drinking too much. Suddenly Miss Gilderay, who sat next to him, said in a low voice, "I used to do that too." "Do what?" "I'll tell you." She raised her voice and addressed the others. "I was just saying to Mr Castle that I, too, have a confession which I might make. It does not seem to be fair that you, Sir Felix, and you, Mr Castle, should tell the worst of yourselves, and that I should still let you believe the best of me." "I don't want you to suppose," said Sir Felix, "that there's the slightest compulsion upon you to say even one word. You mustn't feel bound to disclose anything." "Down here, so near the end, disclosure is really very easy. You see, it does not matter any more. I shall not be mixing with other people. I have not got to pretend that I am almost without fault. The only thing I am afraid of is that you will laugh at me, or want to laugh at me. I've got no illusions about myself. I know that I am not pretty, and never have been pretty. I am elderly, and it must seem absurd for me to speak of romance and love." "I am sure," said Mr Agravine, "that we shall not want to laugh at you. No one ever wants to laugh at anything which is quite genuine." "Hear, hear!" said Castle, rapping noisily on the table. Miss Gilderay moistened her lips with the tip of her tongue, looked at them unflinchingly, and began to speak. My father was the vicar of a London church which was, in its way, rather celebrated. The music was very good, the ritual was very ornate, and the sermons were very short. My father was a good musician and a very fair man of the world. He understood business thoroughly, and the greater part of his income was derived from careful speculations. There was a stockbroker in his congregation, an old man called Baldwin, who thought very highly of my father, as indeed most people did, and he used to advise him. My father was very careful that the world in general should know nothing of these business transactions, but to me he always defended them. He said that there were many calls upon his charity, and that one could only give in proportion to one's income. If he made money in steel commons, then he had the more to give away. He reminded me that some of the apostles themselves got their living as fishermen. It did not seem to me the same thing at all, but I did not criticize him. I was too fond of him to be critical. I used to help my father a good deal, doing all his secretarial work for him. I would type out his sermon and his instructions to his broker all in the same morning. The choir of the church was for the most part paid, and paid by my father out of his own pocket. He said it was almost impossible to get good music except from professionals. But one day he came to me in a state of great delight. He had found a new and admirable singer, a tenor, who was willing to give his services for nothing. "He's a gentleman," said my father, and paused. "Or almost," he added. I laughed, and told him that I knew that kind. When I saw the new tenor, Henderson his name was, I still felt that I knew that kind. He had good looks of rather a common description. His eyes were too small, his face too fat. He was slightly under the average height, I should say. I was quite prepared to take no interest in him whatever. And then I heard him sing, and forgot the man in the voice. He had a real tenor, and his singing was perfectly true. Somehow it was impossible to hear it without believing that behind that voice there was a beautiful and noble temperament. As a matter of fact, I know now that this is one of the commonest of illusions. Music has its special beauty which is quite isolated. It does not imply any other beauty of any kind. But that was 10 years ago. Every Sunday I heard that man sing. I do not think now that I fell in love with the man, but I fell in love with the voice, and began to make inquiries about him, and found nothing very romantic. He was employed in an insurance office, and was doing very well. He was unmarried, and lived with his 2 sisters. One Sunday morning he had been taking the solo part in the anthem, and I suppose that I was more than usually impressed. At any rate, when I got home, I wrote a foolish letter and sent it to him. It was my belief that I had not committed myself in any way. I had given no address and put no signature. In case my handwriting should be recognized, I had typed the letter. Some weeks later my father thought he should take some notice of this Mr Henderson, and told me to ask him to dinner. He came, and every minute I liked him less and less. In the drawing room afterwards he got a chance to speak with me apart. "You do all your father's typing for him, don't you?" he said. I assented. I had typed lists and notices for the use of the choir, which, of course, he would have seen. "You ought to have a new letter F put on that machine," he said. "The top of it's gotten broken off. I notice these little things. I have noticed that broken F in everything that you have typed." I did not lose my head. I said it was very likely that the machine was always open, and that it was my belief that one of the housemaids used it to type her love letters on. I said that I would have the F key put right, but that I could not make out how on earth he came to have noticed it. This was as good as I could do, but it did not deceive him, and I saw that it had not deceived him. Before the evening was over I hated him far more than I had ever loved him. I spent a sleepless night in an agony of humiliation, and the next day I was tortured with neuralgia. That was the beginning of it. To relieve the pain of the neuralgia, for the first time in my life, I drank wine. "Look here, Miss Gilderay," said Sir Felix, "we quite understand. You need not tell us the rest of it." Miss Gilderay smiled mournfully. "I am not going to tell you the whole story. It is quite loathsome. I do not think that I could do it. It is the story of endless effort and endless failure. The thing became public at last, and my father had to leave that parish. He died a few months afterwards, and I suppose his death saved me. At any rate, I have been able to do the most difficult thing of all. I am not now what I once was, neither am I an abstainer. I drank a glass of wine at lunch just now. I shall drink another at dinner. But don't imagine that I am proud of my victory over myself. I could not be that, knowing as I do at what cost it was bought. Nor can it ever blot out of my mind the shame of so much previous defeat. I have spoken of it with a reason, though." She looked full at Mr Castle. All right," he said impatiently. "All these things have a physiological explanation." "Yes," said Mr Agravine. "And what explains the physiology?" Mr Castle glared and said nothing. Zoe Averill changed her place, and now sat next to Miss Gilderay. "It always seemed to me a pity," Mr Agravine continued, "that any convention which is entirely false should be generally accepted. That is the case of the convention that divides people into saints and sinners. There are no saints, and in a sense there are no sinners. We are human beings, defective, but with some goodness. If we could only get that to be recognized, if that were the general opinion of society, society would be all the better for it." "I have often thought," Sir Felix said, "that the case is very hard of a man who goes to prison once. What happens to him when he comes out? By most people he is not forgiven, and in the other cases forgiveness is patronage. Both are as bad as can be. And yet I don't see what other line is to be taken. To treat crime solely as a disease is more amicable than practical." "I have no panacea," said Mr Agravine. "I can't make a new heaven and a new earth, but in my time I have often wished I could make a new earth." "The fact of the case is," said Mrs Langley, "that one can't make any general rules at all. We can only deal with special cases as they arise as intelligently and as humanely as possible." "I see," said Mr Castle, "that you take a very superior standpoint, Mrs Langley. You pose as a righteous person, who is to do her best for people like, well, like Miss Gilderay and myself." "I do not pose at all," said Mrs Langley. "I was not thinking of how I should judge, but of how I should wish to be judged. If you want to know, I have already made my confession. Miss Gilderay has been a friend of mine for 3 years past. Last night I told her something that I had never told her or anybody else before. I am not going to tell you any more now, except that some time after my marriage I went through a week of madness. My punishment has been that I have had to be a coward, that I have had to join in the general combination against more than one woman, though I knew that they were little, if at all, more guilty than myself. You have made me face this shame before you men. Now, are you content? You know perfectly well that I had intended nothing of the kind." He moved away from the table and sat in the furthest corner of the hall with his back to the others. Presently he took a cigarette from his case and lit it. "I say," said Sir Felix, "just put that down, will you, and stick your heel on it." Mr Castle scowled, but did as he was told. The others rose and began to clear away the things on the table. 4. The confession of Mr Agravine and the story of Miss Averill, and so to a conclusion. The 3 women spent most of the afternoon in their own quarters. In the hall Mr Agravine, with his pocket knife in his hands, sat and carved a peach stone. He was astonishingly clever at work of that kind. Sir Felix wrote with the writing block on his knee. If, as seemed likely, their bodies were ultimately dug out, he wished to leave behind him some instructions with reference to his property, and also with reference to the excavation work which he had in hand. Castle did nothing but sit in sulky silence. At 5 o'clock Sir Felix looked at his watch. "Agravine," he said, "we've been shut up now for 26 hours. What do you think of it?" "I think another 22 hours will see the end of it. Before that time we shall have to light the charcoal stove and finish quickly. Have you got it ready?" "Not yet. Come along to the store room, and I'll show you how the thing works." Castle followed the 2 men and stood watching them, his hands in his pockets. Once or twice he asked a brief question. The visit to the store room gave him an opportunity to resume possession of the whisky bottle. Before dinner time he had finished it. The other 2 men remonstrated with him, but he said gloomily that a man condemned to death had the right to eat and drink what he liked. He refused to join the others at dinner. In truth, dinner had become a farce. Confinement and oppressive air had destroyed the appetite of all of them. Even their conversation was at first quite without animation. But presently Miss Gilderay said, "Do you know what Zoe Averill has been telling us this afternoon? She says that she hears somebody coming." "Don't laugh at me," said Zoe Averill. "I'm quite sure." Sir Felix looked across at Mr Agravine. Were they all of them going mad, then? "I don't see the possibility of it," said Sir Felix. Suddenly from his corner Mr Castle burst into a loud laugh. "What else did you expect?" he shouted. "It's the High Priest come back to see the Christians who have defied his tomb, and to watch their last agony." "I think," said Mr Agravine, "that you would do better to be quiet, Mr Castle." Castle growled that in future he would do what he liked. "The question rather is," said Miss Gilderay, "if we want anybody to come. I mean if we want to be rescued. I don't think I do particularly. Life does not hold very much for a plain and unmarried woman of my age, and yet—" "Yes," said Mrs Langley, "and yet. I know what you mean. Instinct is too strong for us. We thought we were sick of the world, but we would both go back to it if we could." "I also," said Sir Felix. "Not me!" shouted Castle. "Not me! I would go back alone, but not with the rest of you. You all know too much. One would never be safe. At least, you think you know too much. That story I told you was make-up, to draw you all on. Idiots! Fools!" Sir Felix stood up. "Get out of this, Mr Castle. We cannot have you with us." Castle did not move till Sir Felix was quite near him. Then he rose and lurched out of the hall and down the passage, flinging himself into one of the chambers at the side. They went back to the point at which he had interrupted them. "Personally," said Mr Agravine, "I think I should be contented either way. The effect of being buried alive for a few hours has been to show me that the whole of my life has been a mistake. I have been a collector, as you know. True, I have collected beautiful things. That makes no difference. Property has been my master. Property has made me do base and degrading things. Of one thing I am certain. If by any chance Miss Averill were right, and we were rescued, I would change my way of life. My pictures should go to the nation. I would be the slave of property no longer." "I don't think I quite understand," said Mrs Langley, "what you mean by that." "I shall tell you. It can hardly be called a confession. It is really too paltry for that. I was hypnotized, fascinated, by the collector's mania, and that drove me into stupidities." "Still," said Mrs Langley, "tell us. It will make the time pass." "I suppose," said Mr Agravine, "that it is not the love of beautiful things which degrades. I hope not, for I have always had that love. Degradation comes, not from love, but from possession, and that applies to more things than pictures. Until quite recently I was not a wealthy man. All that I could possibly spare was spent in the acquisition of what might be called stagnant capital. The possession of £1,000 picture costs a man £40 a year, whether he knows it or whether he does not. I was frequently hard pressed for money. I was frequently tortured by being compelled to relinquish some purchase on which I had set my heart. Such things do one no good. Again, I have not been a picture dealer in the accepted sense of the word, but I have often sold one beautiful thing in order to acquire something which I thought more beautiful. I made the greatest profit that I possibly could. I brought commerce very near to a swindle. One instance particularly lingers in my memory. It was a thing which I did quite deliberately, and it now seems to me both cruel and absurd to have done it. A friend of mine told me that he knew an old Frenchman living in Eastbourne who wished to dispose of a picture. He knew nothing of its history, but believed it to be good. He wanted an expert opinion upon it, and I was an expert. To oblige my friend, I went down to Eastbourne one Saturday to see this Frenchman. Janvier his name was. Janvier was a bachelor living in a small house, with just sufficient income of his own. In all matters of art I soon found that he was absolutely ignorant, but none the less he had from time to time bought pictures, some 20 of them. He brought out his great prize, the picture which he believed to be good, and I was able to tell him at once whereabouts in the National Gallery he would be able to find the original of which it was rather a poor copy. But among the 20 there was one other picture which I saw at once I should have to buy. I spoke to him about it. "It was sold to me," he said (he spoke admirable English), "as being, in all probability, by Corot." I laughed, and told him that a great many pictures were sold in that way, and that if Corot had lived to be 100 years, and painted every minute of his time, he could not have covered all the canvases which have since been assigned to him. All the same, that picture was a genuine and very fine Corot, and I knew it. "I gave £10 for it," said Janvier, "and I would not take less than 20." I told him that 100 per cent. Seemed rather a large profit to expect, but after a certain amount of grumbling I wrote him a cheque for 20 and took the picture back to town with me. It is one of the best things in my collection, and it is worth a very large sum, and I am heartily ashamed of it. "But," said Miss Gilderay, "is there, after all, anything dishonest about it? If the people who are ignorant try to do business with the people who are expert, has not the expert got the right to profit by it? It ought not to mean that he should buy a fine Corot for £20. Do you still hear some one coming, Miss Averill? For I assure you that if we are ever released, Janvier shall have his picture back." "Well," said Sir Felix, "we have all told our stories now except Miss Averill, and she is too young to have any story to tell." "I have done good things and bad things, but nothing very good or very bad," said Zoe. "And yet," said Sir Felix, "you said you were not sorry that this had happened, and that your life was to come to an end." "That is true, but it is the future and not the past from which I was eager to escape. I will tell you just a little thing, a scrap of family history. My parents died when I was a child, and one of my earliest recollections is that I was rather proud of my hair, because an artist had admired it and had asked to paint me, and that my mother told me not to be proud of it, and that if I knew, it would be a cause of grief to me. I did not know. She was speaking of a tradition which had been in our family for 6 generations. It was only a year ago that in some papers of my father's I came upon the story. From time to time during the last 6 generations, a girl had been born in the Averill family with hair like mine, and in every case she had come to disaster. In most of the cases recorded she had died insane. During their lifetime my father and mother had said nothing of this to me, and I believed that, if my father had not died so suddenly, he would have destroyed those papers in order to spare me. Ever since I read them, I have been haunted. For it is true that I am not quite normal. Every now and then, not at my own wish, and often to no serious purpose, I have had what Mrs Langley calls that special sense. I have seen things that were happening far away. It's a pity, because I love life." "And if we are rescued?" said Mr Agravine. "What is to be, is to be. If I had meant to take my life, I should have done so a year ago. If I am rescued, I shall go back and meet whatever fate has got for me. And I think we shall be rescued, for now I hear far more distinctly the sound of people coming. Listen! Can you not all hear it?" For a moment all held their breath. There was a tense, deep silence. And then suddenly Mr Agravine rose and put his ear to the wall. "It is so," he said. "Come here, Burden, and listen." Sir Felix listened for a moment. "There can be no mistake about it. That is the sound of picks. There are many of them at work. In a few hours now they should get through to us." "Wouldn't it be a good thing if I went and told Mr Castle?" said Zoe Averill. "I think it was he who most wanted to get back to the world again." "No," said Sir Felix, "don't do that. I will go and tell him myself." He went, and in a few moments returned. He said nothing until Miss Gilderay questioned him. "Yes," he said, "I've told him." "Hasn't that made any difference?" asked Mrs Langley. "What did he say?" "He says that the spirit of the High Priest is in him, and that this is his tomb. Nothing else. Mad, of course. But he is perfectly quiet. He will probably recover when he gets out of this." The women had a feeling that their rescuers should find them ready, and that everything should be in order. Helped by Sir Felix and Mr Agravine, they cleared the table out of the hall altogether. In the chamber where he lay, they could hear Mr Castle breathing heavily, as though asleep. About an hour later, as Sir Felix and Mr Agravine sat listening to the sound of the picks, the women entered. Mrs. Langley was drawing on her gloves and carried her camera. Zoe had changed into her own clothes again. Miss Gilderay had rearranged her hair. They were all quite ready. "This is good of you," said Sir Felix. "It will be much pleasanter if we five all wait together. There is only another hour or two now. Listen." They could hear the blows of the picks. They sat down, and for a time talked a little, wondering who had organized the rescue and how it had been accomplished. And presently, because the air was very heavy and they had been short of sleep the night before, and a great strain had been taken off their minds, they became drowsy. "I believe I'm going to sleep," said Miss Gilderay, leaning back in her deck chair. "I, too," said Sir Felix. "Why not? It will help pass the time of waiting." Soon they were so soundly asleep that they did not hear the stealthy footsteps from the adjoining chamber. Silent and barefooted, carrying the glowing charcoal stove in his hands, Castle crept into the storeroom. With deep breaths he drew in the poison. He turned to tear down the curtain that filled the entrance to the room, in order that the fumes might spread and all might die together. But before he could reach it he swayed and fell, and lay motionless. And now the picks broke through into the entrance hall of the tomb. Through the opening streamed in a glorious sunlight that made the candle flames pale, and fresh, untainted air. And with these came fresh life and fresh courage to face it, for all, save that dead boy lying behind the curtain by the charcoal stove. End of Chapter 5. Recording by Todd.
Chapter 6 of Stories in Grey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Grzynski. Stories in Grey by Barry Payne. Chapter 6. The Unknown God. The air of the primitive and remote island was soft and languorous. Its population consisted of a man and woman, brown-skinned and without any of the blessings of education and religion. This afternoon the population had been bathing, and now lay on the sand in the sun. "Presently," said the man, "we will go and look at the boat which has drifted ashore." "Presently," said the girl lazily. "It is a good boat." "Very good boat," echoed the man. "It will be useful to us." And immediately he fell asleep. In a moment or two the girl awakened him. She was in a philosophical humor, and there is not much fun in being philosophical all by yourself. "Are you happy?" she asked. "I do not know," said the man. "I've never thought about it." "Then you are happy," she said with decision. "People who think about it are not. I, for example, am not. If we now roused ourselves a little and caught a few fish?" "No," said the girl decisively. "I wish to talk." The man sighed. "Do you not know what it is to wish to be taken out of yourself and to become somebody else? To be full of inspiration from the gods? These days and nights that are always the same are becoming a burden to me. I want to be different for a little while." "It is not possible," said the man. "There are gods, undoubtedly. It was always the opinion of our forefathers that there were gods. But the gods never interfere with us, and we cannot get at them. Therefore they do not concern us, and it is much better to catch a few fish." The girl, looking as if she might burst into tears at any moment, said that she hated fish, and that she hated her island, and that she hated herself. "I wish to meet with one of the gods," she said. "I wish to talk with someone who is more than mortal. Tell me what the gods look like." "As to that," said the man, "more than one opinion has been expressed. There are some who say that the gods are like big men, taller than the palm trees, of gigantic strength. There are others who say that the gods cannot be seen, and that it is only by their influence within us that they may be recognized. To talk of things which we do not know is very foolish. If you will not catch fish, let us go and look at the boat." The woman arose rather sullenly and followed him. They found in the boat a tin containing biscuits. They had never seen biscuits before, but a little investigation showed them the use to which they should be put. They bored holes in them and hung them round their necks. They found, moreover, a large square bottle containing a colorless fluid. The girl removed the cork, dipped her finger in the fluid, and touched her tongue. "Of what does it taste?" asked the man anxiously. "Of fire and sleep and sin," answered the girl. "In that case," said the man, "I will go and fetch our drinking cups." The drinking cups were 2 halves of the shell of a coconut, smooth and polished by much use. The man filled them, and they drank in slow sips. A drink which tastes of fire and sleep and sin cannot be taken hastily. As she filled their cups for the second time, the girl observed that she believed there was a god in that bottle. Next morning the girl awoke and zigzagged from the point where she had fallen down the beach to the sea. She kept her head under water for the longest possible time. Then she rose to the surface and swam slowly and lazily. Presently the man's head shot up by her side. He also had been down below. "There can be no doubt about it at all," said the girl. "We have found the unknown god, and by his influence within us, he may be recognized." "I do not feel at all good this morning," said the man. "Nor I," said the girl, "but last night was magnificent. Never have I danced so long and so wildly. Never have I laughed so much." "I had an impression," said the man, as he swam by her side, "that I was being unusually witty." "No," said the girl, "I do not think it was that. Everything was amusing. I laughed at the sea. I laughed at the boat. I laughed at the trees. You also laughed." "I remember it," said the man. "The entire world had suddenly become ridiculous. But this morning I do not feel at all good." He dived under a wave with the girl after him, and presently they lay side by side on the sand. "It is about this time in the morning," said the girl, "that we generally catch fish for our breakfast. But today I do not wish to catch fish for my breakfast, and I think I do not wish to eat anything more as long as I live." "I have the same feeling," said the man. "Why then should this be, if indeed it was a god that we found in the boat?" "Because," said the girl, "if with great force you pull the bough of a tree in one direction and then let go, it will swing with great force in the other direction. Because last night we were exalted, therefore this morning we are abased. I am willing. I pay the price. Why do you get up? Where are you going?" "I am going," said the man, "to see if by any chance there is still left in the bottle a little of that drink which tastes of fire and sleep and sin." "Lie down again," said the girl. "There is not any left. I've looked into the matter myself." 2 days later the man and the girl built up a rough altar of white stones on the beach, and on the top of the altar they placed the bottle in which the god had lived. The perfume of his presence was still there. The man thinks now that the girl spends too much time in the contemplation of it. And what will happen when the missionaries land? End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Stories in Grey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Grzinski. Stories in Grey by Barry Payne. Chapter 7. The Last Chance. 1. Dawn was coming. Birds were waking and twittering in the embankment gardens. A cool breeze swept out the heavy and sultry air of the night. In another half hour Mr. Horrocks would be able to extinguish the lights at his coffee stall. Meanwhile, in an interval of business, he talked to a young man who had been a regular customer of his for many nights past. Mr. Horrocks did not remain idle while he talked. He wiped his counter down and gave certain thick cups and saucers as much washing as he thought would be good for them. He was a placid and portly man of 50, much respected by his customers. If two of these scarecrows of the night had a difference, they would occasionally ask Mr. Horrocks to adjudicate, and from his decisions there was no appeal. The young man who was talking to Horrocks was in rags, but he was not altogether ill-looking. He had melancholy eyes and a gentle expression. His speech was the speech of an educated man. "I can find nothing to do," he said. "I'm at the end of my money. I've some thoughts of putting myself in the water. The trouble is that I can swim a bit." Mr. Horrocks considered the proposition without emotion, much as if the young man had said he was going to have his hair cut. "I shouldn't advise it," he said. "You never know your luck. Now, from what some of the others told me tonight, I rather gathered you was one time at Cambridge College." "No, I was an Oxford man. I was sent down." "All the same thing," said Mr. Horrocks. "It means you've got education. That's a grand thing. Wish I had it myself. That gives you an advantage over the others, that does. Schoolmastering, now that's open to you. In these clothes, and with no character." "That's against you," Mr. Horrocks admitted. "Done time?" He put the question as casually as if he had been asking the young man if he knew Brighton. "No, I've never been in prison. I was a gambler and still am. I drink very hard, but I've given that up. It has to be all or nothing with me. I've been chucked by my family and most of my friends, and I've chucked the rest myself out of pride. I believe I have the makings of an artist in me. A painter, you know. Some of the screevers do well enough. You want a dry day and a good pitch." "I don't mean that. I mean real painting. But I can't get at it, and I don't suppose there'd be any money in it if I could. I can't beg or steal or use any tools that make a nasty noise. Some men can, but I can't. I can't do what I don't like." "Ah," said Mr. Horrocks. "If you start picking and choosing, no wonder you finds it difficult. You can't afford to do that. That's what you've got to say to yourself. Seeing now as you can't get at the painting and decorating, what is it you do want?" "I should like your berth very well," said the young man. "Hard work, me young friend. A deal harder than you think." "There are some kinds of work," said the young man reflectively, "that I don't object to at all. I like to be out at night. I like to talk to the people who've gone under. I like to see the dawn coming. You've got an interesting life, Mr. Horrocks. Is there any money in it?" "There isn't a fortune, but there's a livelihood for a worker. If you'd take me on to help you, I'd work." Mr. Horrocks extinguished an evil-smelling flare. "There's no work for you here," he said, "but I might find it for you elsewhere." "Meaning what?" "Meaning that I could do with another stall. I should know where to pitch it and how to work it. If I had it, I'd give you a chance. You can't get a stall in a fit-out like this for nothing. If you could come to me and put down 3 golden sovereigns, I'd start you right away in a sort of partnership with myself." "3 golden sovereigns," said the young man, and laughed. "Well," said Horrocks, "that ought to be possible for a young man who's been to Oxford College and had all the advantages." "Can't be done. I've no more clothes to pawn, nothing but what I stand up in." "If that ring on your ringer ain't flash, you've got a chance still." The ring was a plain gold signet. The young man looked at it. "It's all right," he said. "What could I get for it?" "A sovereign. I'd lend you that on it myself. Then you'd go to the Salvationers or to the Church Army, and they'd show you how to start at peddling. You'll have made the money in a month. It's worth thinking about. Better than the river, anyway." The young man drew the ring from his finger. "I hadn't meant to part with this," he said. "But, however, it's the last chance. Take it, Mr. Horrocks. If you find it's all right, give me a sovereign for it tomorrow night." Mr. Horrocks examined the ring with great care. Then he took a sovereign from his waistcoat pocket and laid it down on the counter. "You can get quite a nice lot of stuff for that," he said. "As much as you can carry. Dress materials and a line of cheap watches is what I should recommend. Get hold of the servants at the good houses. They've all got some money to spend, and they're mostly mugs." "No," said the young man, "I'm not going to do that." "What then?" asked Mr. Horrocks. "Perseus for the Derby," said the young man. "Didn't I tell you I was a gambler?" "They tell me it's all right," said Mr. Horrocks. "There's nothing else in it except the favorite. I'd thought of backing it myself. Still, you see, it's no certainty. The other thing is." The young man laughed, finished his coffee, and walked away. 2. Edward Seaton tramped from London to Epsom. This is the cheapest way to go to the Derby, and on a fine day is not the least pleasant. He had deposited his sovereign with a substantial bookmaker whom he had known in his younger days. He had threepence in his possession. 1 penny of this was to pay for his breakfast. The remaining 2pence was to help him on his way back to town. Of course, he might be able to get a lift for nothing, but it was better to have something in reserve. Queer and erratic, he saw now a possibility of the kind of life that he would like. He would do his utmost to make Horrocks' new coffee stall successful. He himself would live as cheaply as possible. Very soon he would be able to buy the materials, and when his night's work was over, would get 2 or 3 hours of painting before he went to bed. It was a life which would never bring him into contact with any of the people whom he had known in his old days, the people before whom he felt humiliated. He would be dealing with the deadbeat, and he understood them. He had had hours of the greatest excitement, thinking over this last chance, planning the great results that might ultimately follow from his partnership with Mr. Horrocks. His life so far had been a mistake. He had tried to live the conventional life, and had torn up his nerves and driven him to drink. He had neglected his one natural gift. A few sneers from his family had been enough to make him ashamed, and to convince him that he could never become an artist. That was all past now. In future, he would model his life to suit himself, and one day, possibly, he might find himself back in his old position. What he had to do was to be independent, to judge for himself, to map out his own line. In his boyhood, he had tried to be docile, and docility had been a complete failure. He was no longer excited. The moment for that had gone past. He got away from the roaring crowd on the hill and sat at a little distance by himself. He had meant to watch the race, but after the first false start, he found that he could not stand it. It was better for him to sit quietly with his head in his hands. He could hear now the roar of the crowd. "Perseus! Perseus wins! Perseus!" He rose to his feet now and walked slowly back to the crowd. He limped badly, for his feet were blistered with the long walk. "What's won?" he asked of the first man he met. "The favorite," said the man exultantly. "Won by a head. Good finish." Seaton burst out laughing. "Very good finish," he said, and turned away. There would be no hurry to get back to London now. He spent his 2pence on food, for he was terribly hungry, and then sought out some spot on the downs where he could lie quiet and sleep. As he limped along, his eyes caught a bright object lying in the grass. For one breathless moment he thought that luck had come back to him. Then he picked the thing up. It was not a sovereign after all. It was a new farthing, on one side of which a cross had been scratched. As he stood looking at it, 2 people approached him. They belonged to the class that he did not want to meet any more, a man and a woman. The man was elderly and correctly dressed, a veritable tailor's triumph. The woman was very young, pretty, and impulsive in manner. "You found it?" she said eagerly. Seaton raised his cap. "I have found a new farthing," he said. "If that is what you mean, I shall be very happy to return it to you." She stared at him. His words and appearance did not seem to consort together. She took the coin from him, thanked him, and turned to her companion. "George," she said, "give this man a sovereign, please." "Certainly, a shilling by all means, and a very good bargain for you, my fine fellow. If you can keep on exchanging farthings for shillings, you'll soon be rich." "Don't be a fool, George. I said a sovereign. Are you getting deaf already?" "Oh, have it your own way," said the man, as he took the coin from his sovereign case. "But said Edward Seaton to the lady. "Why do you give me a sovereign for a farthing?" "Why? Did you never hear of mascots? That farthing's the finest mascot I ever had in my life. I wouldn't have lost it for anything." "Here, I say," said the man. "We can't stop talking to this chap all day." "Of course you can't," said Seaton. He took the coin, thanked them, and limped away. Here then was a reprieve. The last chance was not yet quite over. It was true that his scheme had failed, but that seemed to him now of much less importance. He would not be compelled to walk back to London, and when he got there he would be able to afford himself the luxury of a bath and a good bed. Also, he would eat and drink, and tomorrow, of course, he would die. He passed through a crowd of shouting bookmakers, and unintentionally his eyes fell on the list of horses for the next race, with the odds chalked up against them. One of the horses had a name which arrested him. He picked his bookmaker very carefully. "What price farthing?" he asked. "30s." "Right," said Seaton, handing up the coin. "I want a sovereign on." The bookmaker was a good-humoured, honest-looking old fellow. He bent down towards Seaton. "Look here," he said, "you don't want no thick in it. Have a shilling on it. It can't win. No earthly. I don't want to take a poor man's money. Put a shilling on and save the rest to buy the Mrs. Tarara." "I dare say you're right," said Seaton, "and you're a good chap anyhow, but I want to put that sovereign on. I suppose you can pay if I win." The bookmaker laughed. "Pay? Yes, and be thankful to have the chance. You're the only man on the earth that's backed it." A few minutes later, Seaton, with £31 in his pocket, was making his way to the railway station, when once more he encountered that extremely well-dressed old gentleman. "I beg your pardon," said Seaton. "Chuck it," said the man. "You get no more out of me today." "I wanted to return this sovereign. Thank you very much for the loan of it." 3. Mr. Horrocks could hardly believe his own eyes. He groped for a possible explanation. "Then you didn't back Perseus after all," he said. "I did, and I lost." "You've got a new fit out of clothes. You've just given me a quid to get your ring back. It beats me. Oh, I see. Your people have been coming down with the stuff, eh?" "No. After the Derby had been run, I borrowed a sovereign and backed the winner for the next race, 30-1. "You, in those rags, managed to borrow a sovereign on the Epsom Downs? Man, you're a genius." "Yes, I know," said Seaton, "but let's talk business." "What? You're still game to come in with me?" "Of course I am. I've got to live, and I want to paint. I shall get my living out of the coffee stall, and I shall get it in a way that won't upset and annoy me. I shall have plenty of time left for painting. I don't sleep much." Seaton went back with Horrocks to his home after business, and was presented to Mrs. Horrocks. He examined such accounts as Horrocks kept, and was surprised to find that so much profit could be made by catering, in part at any rate, for the last pennies of the deadbeat. Of course, Horrocks had working men customers as well, substantial men who really breakfasted. For the next few nights, Seaton assisted Horrocks with his stall and learned more thoroughly the details of the trade. After that, he managed another stall by himself. 10 years later, when Edward Seaton was elected Associate of the Royal Academy, nobody was surprised. Many thought that he should have been elected earlier. Good fortune had followed him persistently. The first 2 pictures that he sent in to the Academy were hung on the line. They were London subjects, Dawn on the Embankment and Saturday Night in the Edgware Road. They were mentioned with approval by a bishop preaching in Westminster Abbey. In all questions of art, the bishop was an innocent child, but that did not matter. Through the whole of Monday, there was always a little group of people in front of Seaton's pictures. A critic, who had returned to the show after many days in order to settle a point in dispute between himself and another critic, noticed the group, and for the first time noticed Seaton's pictures. He spent about half an hour on them, and then decided to discover Seaton. He discovered him in an article in a daily paper, also in various paragraphs, also in conversation with critics and other artists. The innocent bishop, finding to his utter amazement that he had for once appreciated a work of art, purchased Dawn on the Embankment for the sum of £100. He subsequently sold it for £500, and we may be sure that he devoted the profits to some good purpose. Having taken his line, Seaton kept it. He never painted a portrait. He never painted anything except London. The critic, who had been his first evangelist, was in the habit of saying that Seaton had discovered London. In the following exhibition, he again showed two pictures, Sunset in Regent's Park and The Coffee Stall. He sold both of these, and sold them well. It was at this juncture that he gave up work at the coffee stall himself and became known once more to his family and friends. His family, having done their very utmost to prevent Edward from becoming an artist, now rejoiced in a success which they asserted and believed they had always foretold. On the occasion of his election, a few bachelor friends of his asked him to dine at the club. They were for the most part artists, but the talk after dinner strayed over many subjects, and lingered finally on the subject of the theatre. "I often wonder," said old Burden, "what became of Margaret Gay. She was about the finest Juliet we've ever had. She could play comedy, too, and she was as pretty as one could wish. I wonder why we never hear of her now." "She's been ill," said another man. "I know it because I was painting her portrait at the time. That was a queer thing. She showed me her mascot, a farthing with a cross scratched on it. Her belief in it was intense. She said she would never part from it, and that while she had it with her, luck would never leave her. Next day she was down with rheumatic fever. It was nearly a year ago, and I've got that unfinished portrait in my studio still. I've never seen her since." "Why not?" asked Seaton. "I ought to have done, meant to have done, but just at that time I was most appallingly busy, and afterwards it slipped out of my mind. I suppose she's still alive, as we've seen no obituary notices. I'd go and look her up next week, if I knew where she lived. She had a house at Earl's Court, but somebody or other told me that she had given that up and gone away." "Let's see," said Seaton reflectively. "Whom did she marry?" "Never married anybody. Might have done. As things have turned out, I dare say it would have been better for her if she had. I don't suppose she had saved much money. She was a reckless little woman and a born gambler." "Gambling's a mistake," said Seaton as he filled his glass and passed on the decanter. He himself played bridge for half a crown 100 now, and never for any higher point, and never made a bet. He had given up teetotalism and drank wine at dinner and at no other time. He had got himself in hand. It had taken a good deal of doing, but it was done. On the following morning, Seaton went to a private inquiry office. "I want," he said, "the present address of Miss Gay." "Margaret Gay, the actress?" asked the private detective. "Yes. About a year ago she had a house at Earl's Court. That's all I can tell you. Can you do that for me?" The detective smiled. "I wish I was never asked to do anything more difficult, sir." "You understand that it must be done without Miss Gay's knowledge, without causing her any annoyance." "Quite so. As a matter of course, you will have the address tomorrow, sir." 4. Seaton drove down to Wimbledon in his own car. Then he sent the driver back with the car and started on foot in search of the house. He found it with no great trouble, a very small house in a very back street, and a very young servant answered the bell. "Is Miss Gay in?" "Well," said the maid doubtfully, "she is in, but give her this note, my card's in it, and ask if she will see me." In a minute the maid returned. "Miss Gay will see you, sir." Seaton was shown into a drawing room of the smallest size, principally furnished with a grand piano. As he entered, Margaret Gay rose from her chair by the fire, still holding his note in one hand. She was thinner than when he last saw her, and she was older, as a matter of fact, 32. The impression she made on Seaton was that her beauty had become etherealized and rather pathetic. "I don't understand this at all," she said, as she shook hands with him. "You say I once saved your life. I never did anything so heroical. I'm afraid I've saved very little, and certainly not the life of a famous artist. Won't you sit down and tell me about it, Mr. Seaton?" He sat down and told her his story from beginning to end. "Then," she said, "it was true what I read in one of the newspapers, that you once kept a coffee stall?" "Perfectly true. Quite interesting work for a time." "And is it really true that you've been looking for me ever since?" "Quite true. I did not know your name, you see. I had nothing to go by. It was only 2 nights ago that I was dining with some artists, and they spoke with admiration of your acting." "I'm afraid that's all over," said Margaret. "I hope so," said Seaton, and did not appear to notice that Miss Gay looked slightly perplexed at this. "And one of the artists," he continued, "happened to mention your farthing mascot. Then, of course, I knew. I had a very long illness and had to leave London. I went well down in the world. None of my old friends ever comes near me. How did you get my address?" "In the dirtiest possible way, through a private inquiry office. If any dirtier way had been necessary, I would have taken that. It has taken me 10 years to find you. Once I was on the track, I couldn't, of course, have allowed anything to stop me." "Why not?" "But it's so obvious. Now tell me all about yourself. Who was the man that you called George?" "George Belmont. He was a banker. He was a very good friend of mine until he got angry with me." "All the same, you were quite right to refuse a man who was old enough to be your grandfather. Was he much surprised that I returned him the sovereign?" She laughed. He was astounded. It made the story dearest to his heart. He told it everywhere. He dined out on it. He made people sick of it. "But won't you get on, please? I want more about yourself." "But really, is there any reason why I should tell you?" "There is the best reason in the world, and you shall hear it later. Let me see. You fell ill. Go on, please." And so she told her story, which was ordinary enough. She had at one time been very successful and had earned high salaries. She had been impulsive, generous, and improvident. Rheumatic fever has its sequelae, and she had been ill and unable to work for a long time. She considered that she had now entirely recovered. Seaton disagreed with this, but she found it difficult to get back into her profession again on the old basis. She had an offer from one manager, but it was not very tempting. It was not an offer that he would have ventured to make 2 years before. She was in doubt about it. She still had the farthing mascot, and though it had not treated her very well lately, perhaps after all it would give her a last chance. It was no longer a new farthing. It had grown very dingy. "Perhaps," said Seaton gravely, "if you paid it a little attention, it would reward you. You should clean it, wash it in a 25% solution of sulfuric acid, and polish with pumice." Again she laughed. "How on earth do you know these things?" "Quite simple. I work on copper plates sometimes. Are you going to give me any tea?" "Of course I am." "Then I think I'll step out to the telephone office first." "Something you've forgotten?" "I sent my car back. I wanted to return here at 7 to take us both to dine in town. Afterwards we can go to the theatre, or we can talk, just as you like." "But, you amazing person, you haven't even asked me if I'll go yet. I don't think I ought to, and I don't believe I've got a dress." "Oh, yes, you have. You simply must come. Do you think, when I've found you after 10 years, that I'm going to let you go again? Never. I won't hear of it. Ah, here's the tea." After tea, they cleaned the farthing mascot and brought it to a great state of perfection without using either sulphuric acid or pumice. As they did so, they talked eagerly in close proximity. When the motor car arrived, Margaret Gay was quite ready. As he was driving her back to her house that night, she mentioned once more the engagement which had been offered her. "It's not what I like, but I think I should accept it, don't you?" "No, certainly not." "Why not?" "Because I do not wish my wife to be on the stage." She was astounded. He explained further, and with considerable eloquence. As he kissed her when they said good night, it is probable that she was convinced. End of chapter 7. Chapter 8 of Stories in Grey. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Dan Grzinski. Stories in Grey by Barry Payne. Chapter 8. Her People. 1. "Not got your car here tonight, Miss Irwin?" asked Mr. Fielding. "It was here," said Lydia. "I sent my maid back in it with the floral tributes." "That's you all over," said Mr. Fielding with enthusiasm. "Any other woman would have kept her car for herself and sent her maid back in a taxi. My driver's been up late 3 nights running now. That was why I didn't let him wait. I expect my bouquets were getting rather thirsty, too." "You love flowers?" said Mr. Fielding. He still lingered at the door of the taxicab. A kind old man, but he bored the great violinist extremely. "Yes, but I don't like to be suffocated by them, so I let poor Stamford be suffocated by them instead. Good night, Mr. Fielding. Thanks so much." "Mayn't I see you home?" "Oh, no, certainly not," said Lydia, laughing. "But thank you again." "Bore!" she exclaimed with conviction as the cab passed down Regent Street. Presently she picked up the communication tube and spoke to the driver. He had been given her home address away in South Kensington. She now directed him to stop at the next corner on the near side. A big private car was waiting here. She dismissed her cab and overpaid the driver. She always overpaid everybody. The door of the private car stood open now, and the young man who had emerged from it raised his hat to her. "I've not kept you waiting," she said, smiling. "Old Fielding would cling on to me and talk." "Poor old Fielding," said the young man. "Get in, won't you? No, you've not kept me waiting." The car moved slowly on through the heavy traffic. For a few seconds they sat in silence. Then he took her hands and kissed them. "You're a darling," he said, "and you played divinely tonight." "It's a very good thing that you're so fond of music," she said, "but it's a still better thing that you don't know too much about it. In that last movement, well, I was rather glad the maestro wasn't there. He wouldn't have told me that I played divinely. It's quite probable that he would have sworn at me." "The pig!" said the man. "Oh, don't say that. I adore him, you know." "Do you adore me more?" "I shan't tell you anything about it." "Why couldn't I come straight to the Queen's Hall for you tonight? Was it simply the feminine desire for mystery and romance?" "Oh, dear, no. One must avoid scandal." "That's all? Most people there know your car and your liveries. Mr. Fielding knows that you are a married man, and I am an unmarried woman. He would come to conclusions." "I suppose he has to know the truth sooner or later." "His conclusions would not be the truth. When the time comes when I give myself to you, then he may know everything. I shall never see him again then. I shall never see England again." "You give up too much for me. Your career, your reputation, everything." "I want to give up everything for you." 2 weeks longer to wait. How long 2 weeks can be. "But after that our lives are in front of us." As the car stopped before her house, he kissed her on the mouth. She got out and ran up the steps. She waited there till the car was out of sight. Then she opened the door with a little gold key that hung from her wrist. 2. It has happened that a horse taken out of the shafts of a cab has subsequently won a classic race. Genius has no pedigree. Mr. Irwin was a fairly prosperous grocer and a provision merchant at Helmstone. His wife was kindly and apologetic. Neither of them had been greatly endowed by nature. Not one of the other children soared far above the commonplace. Lydia was the star of the family. She reverted to some long-forgotten ancestor. Almost her earliest recollection was one of grief and tears because the piano was out of tune. Musical genius has very little chance nowadays of remaining in obscurity. Lydia's first teacher spoke to the leader of the orchestra at Helmstone. The leader of the orchestra sniffed and was superior, but said he would hear the kid. After he had heard the kid, he passed the news a little further up the great staircase, and an elderly gentleman in a fur coat, Mr. Fielding, to be precise, came down from London. Mr. Fielding talked to Mr. Irwin, and it was all settled. Lydia received most of her musical education abroad. Now that she was in the front rank of violinists, she had perforce to travel much. A part of the year she was at her own house at South Kensington. Very seldom was she at home. Her visits were great occasions. She came laden with presents and with glory, and the family made no attempt to conceal their inordinate pride in her. When Lydia was expected, the piano tuner was summoned, and the man with the mechanical piano, who played waltzes in the drive of the Elms, Mr. Irwin's private residence, was instructed to discontinue himself until further notice. Mrs. Irwin consulted a little notebook in which she had written down every preference that Lydia had ever expressed. The 2 weeks, which to one man were to seem so long, were drawing to an end. Lydia had made up her mind to spend her last 3 days in her old home. She did not mean to tell any of her people what her intentions were. She justified herself to herself. She was about to run away with a married man, but that statement did not tell all the truth. He was married to a woman who was chronically ill and chronically ill-tempered, a woman who had told him more than once that she wished he were dead. For 5 years he had suffered for his mistake, and Lydia felt that he had suffered long enough. As for herself, she had been adored by many people. Her appearance was of a romantic type, and many men had fallen under her spell. She had grown weary of this persistent adoration, just as she had grown weary of the scent of too many roses and of the roar of applause. She had never loved but one man, and to that one man, whatever the judgment of the world might be, she intended to give her life. Indeed, she felt as if she were now going to begin life. All that had gone before had been but a preparation for this. She closed the door on her old self, said good-bye to her own people, and went out, as it seemed to her, towards infinite possibilities. She had brought much luggage for a 3 days' visit, but that did not surprise her family. Lydia always brought much luggage. Clara said that she wore a new dress every 10 minutes, and was almost afraid to admire any of them. If she admired anything of Lydia's, Lydia gave it to her at once. Her father and mother met Lydia at the station. "It takes a good deal," he said, "to get me away from my business at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but still there are occasions." "I wish there were more of them," said Mrs. Irwin. "Your father does too much, Lydia." Certainly, Lydia thought, he seemed older and more worn, although he was perfectly cheerful. "The fact of the case is," he said to Lydia, "we've had to face some serious competition of late. One of the big cut-price gangs has started a branch not 10 doors away from my own shop. For some time I was nervous about it, but I met each move they made. I sold stuff for less than it cost me, sooner than be left behind." "It's all right now?" asked Lydia. "Oh, yes, it's all right now. They hadn't got the quality, that's where I had my pull. There's plenty of room for both of us in Helmstone. they taking the low class and me taking the rest. We came to an arrangement. Yes, we're quite on good terms now. If I meet their manager in the street, we always have a chat together. They aren't bad people at all, for a low-class trade." "I wish you were out of business altogether," said Lydia. "You've done enough. You ought to take a rest." "Ah," said Mr. Irwin, "that's what your mother said. But we're not so rich as all that. It may come one of these days." Two of Lydia's sisters, Clara and Ruth, and Lydia's youngest brother Bill, were at home. Her two other brothers were away at a public school, and her other sister, Catherine, was giving cooking demonstrations at a domestic training college. Mrs. Irwin gave a favorable report of all the absentees. "Yes," said Lydia's father, "all my children are good, and one of them is famous. I don't want to boast, but upon my word I might." The 3 days passed very quietly. The provinciality and narrowness of her people impressed Lydia much less than their goodness. Their unbounded faith in her touched her. Clara and Ruth were absolutely without any jealousy. They did not merely accept the fact that Lydia was brilliant, and they themselves not. They rejoiced and gloried in her superiority. "But," said Lydia to Ruth one day, "you mustn't exaggerate about me, or you'll make people laugh at me. I didn't invent the fiddle, you know." "That's almost what it comes to," said Ruth. "You show people what can be done with it." "There have been a few others," said Lydia, laughing. "Kubelik isn't bad for a beginner." Her small brother rather amused Lydia. He was an extremely grave and reserved boy. He considered any demonstration of affection to be unmanly. He told Lydia solemnly that he was pleased to see her. Later he admitted that he had changed the name of one of his rabbits, and had changed it in Lydia's favor. Mrs. Irwin had to remonstrate mildly with Lydia about Bill. He really ought not to have so much money to spend. He was too young. If Mrs. Irwin felt any uneasiness at all on Lydia's account, it was because of her extravagance in the matter of presents. She rained presents upon the entire family. She sent hampers of presents to the boys at the public school. She sent a traveling bag of great luxury to the demonstrator of cookery. She showed the utmost ingenuity at discovering things which her father and mother might possibly want, and great celerity in procuring them. "And when shall we see you again?" they asked when it was time for her to go. "Soon," said Lydia. "Very soon." 3. The young man drove up to the little junction, left his magnificent car in the station yard, and went to meet the local train from Helmstone. It was late and leisurely as usual. Lydia did not travel with her maid when she went down to Helmstone, and for a few minutes the man was busy with luggage. "I've got the car outside," he said. "Why?" said Lydia. "You had my letter this morning, didn't you?" "Yes, but I can't leave it like that. Don't you see that I can't possibly do without you now? You must come with me. You belong to me." He turned to a porter and gave a direction about the luggage, but Lydia forestalled him. "All those things in the London Express. How long have I to wait?" 20 minutes, m'lady. Should have been more, but the local's a little after her usual time." "Very good," said Lydia. "Look after all these things for me. I have a carriage reserved for me on the train. The name's the same as on the luggage. You'll find it when the train comes in." "I'll see to all that, m'lady. There shan't be any mistake." He was not a man of great intelligence, but he had a fine flair for potential generosity. Ladies who reserved first-class carriages for themselves could afford to be generous, and the porter believed the application of a courtesy title to be soothing and emollient. He had already addressed the young man as captain. Lydia now turned to the young man. "I can give you 20 minutes," she said. "I don't want 20 minutes. I want the whole of your life." She shrugged her shoulders. "Then if you don't care to talk until the train comes in, I won't keep you. You said your car was waiting outside, I think." Will you come in here?" he said sulkily, opening the door of a waiting room. And before the fire in the dingy waiting room they sat on uncomfortable chairs and talked. "I suppose," said the young man, "I've done something you don't like. I don't know what it is, and you don't tell me in your letter. Tell me now. I apologize in advance. Surely it must be something that I can put right again." "No, it's not that," said Lydia. "Then you have ceased to care for me?" "I shall never cease to care for you," said Lydia simply and with conviction. "Then you must come with me now. Think no more about it, but come. You had quite made up your mind, you know." "Yes, I had. I have changed it again, and for the last time." "Why? Tell me at least why." "I tried to tell you in my letter, but I suppose I'm not so good at writing as I am at playing the fiddle. It's almost a matter of business." "Business? What do you mean? What has business got to do with it?" "One may pay too much for anything. I should have to pay for my happiness with the misery of other people. It is like paying for it with stolen money, and with money stolen from those who are very dear to me. Your people would understand in time, and when they understood, they would forgive. You don't know my people at all. It is quite certain they would forgive. It is equally certain that they would never understand. I do not wish them to have to forgive." "What is it you mean to do, then?" "I am going back to London tonight. I have had an extremely good offer for an American tour. It was forwarded to me this morning. Tomorrow I shall see my agent about it. I am going to accept that offer. I shall be away for 6 months, and I shall make a great deal of money." "What do you want to make a great deal of money for? You know that I hate the idea of your making money on the concert platform, and as it happens, there's not the least necessity for it, if you come with me." She tapped the floor with her foot impatiently. "Must I keep repeating it? I am not going away with you. In future you have my friendship, if you will accept it. But until you are a free man, you can have nothing else. I am sorry if I hurt you, but remember that I hurt myself too. It is better than hurting so many other people. I am not going to make this money entirely for myself." Her last words were drowned by the roar of the express as it entered the station. She had to repeat them. "Why, then?" the young man asked. "My father is growing old. He seems to have grown much older in this last year, and—" The door of the waiting room opened. "Don't want to hurry you, my lady," said the porter, "but everything's in, and you've only 2 minutes. Will the gentleman be coming?" "No," said Lydia. The young man followed her to her carriage. They reached it only just in time. The porter noted a certain formality in their farewell handshake. It did not distress him. He had just received half a crown for 2 pennyworth of work, and was quite satisfied. End of chapter 8.